Hi, guys. This is Joe Sanborn with the Music Group. I'd like to welcome everybody to our X32 Live webinar and user group. Today's topic is going to be an X32 overview. Just a few things about webinars. What we're basically going to be doing is a 1-hour presentation, followed by a really exciting part of the event, which is an additional hour of questions and live demos, where we'll actually do anything that you guys want to throw out at us. If you take a look at the Go to My Webinar interface, there is a questions area. And this is an area throughout the webinar that you can go and type any questions as we're going through different things. And we'll make sure that we get to any of those questions at the end of the presentation. So I wanted to just start out, usually with webinars, it's nice to know who's actually talking on the other end of the webinar. And this is myself, Joe Sanborn. This is actually our entire product specialist team in the US. And this is John DiNicola, the other presenter for today. And if any of you guys, over the past couple of months since we've released the X32, some of you might have gone to some of our clinic events. This is our X32 van, which is out on a US tour right now. So we've pretty much have been from one end of the country all the way to the other with the X32 doing clinics and shows all over the country. Just wanted to take a second to roll through the agenda. We're going to be talking about the Midas Clark Technic connection to the X32, basic X32 layout, the X32 channel strip, features that make mixing easier, X32 effects section, X32 add-on items such as the S16 and the P16. We're going to be doing a tips and tricks section. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have an open hour at the end for questions and live demos. Wanted to talk for a second about the Music Group. I technically work for the Music Group. This is a conglomerate of companies starting 22 years ago with Behringer. We also own Bugera guitar amps, Midas and Clark Technic, two legendary companies in the touring world. And back in June, we also purchased Turbo Sound. I want to talk for a second about a specific brand, the Midas brand. If there's one thing that Midas definitely knows, it's digital mixing technology. This is their XL8 mixing console. If you take a look at the XL8, it has 432 input channels. It weighs almost 1,400 pounds, and it's got a $300,000 price tag. Obviously, with consoles in this price range, Midas is used on all the top tours. AC/DC, the Rolling Stones, Metallica. Even, these front-of-house engineers are becoming legendary guys out on these large tours. Here's our little baby, the X32, coming hot off the line. Now, I bring up Midas before we get into the actual talking about the X32. There is a number of technologies which are coming over directly from Midas now that Midas is part of our conglomerate of companies. What specifically did we add into the X32 that kind of came over from that heritage? Well, starting with Midas-designed mic preamps. Every single X32 has 32 built-in mic pre's, and those are all going to be Midas quality. This is much different than any other Behringer product that we've ever offered in the past. The other main area that kind of comes over from Midas is just the ergonomics of the X32. I've been a mix engineer most of my life, and I've done a ton of live touring. And the one thing that I noticed when I got in front of the X32 is everything just kind of feels where it needs to be. One thing, as we're going through the presentation, you're going to notice is that there is no digging through menus or different screens to find what it is that you want to work with. Everything is right there, kind of where you need it. On the left-hand side, you have a bank of 16 input faders. Right above the input faders is a channel strip, a virtual channel strip, to get to any of the functions on any of those channels. To the right of the input faders are your bus faders, which also double as DCA faders and allow you to control your matrix mixes. There's mute groups right near your right hand. There's an assign section right above that. So it just feels like everything is right where you need it on the X32. The other thing that came over from the partnerships with our different companies is AES-50 technology. This is a patented technology that Clark Technic owns. So we were able to add that onto the back of the X32. And we're going to be getting into this a little bit later in the slides, but just in general, AES-50 allows you to have a digital snake system down a single Cat5 wire. It's 96 channels with 48 in, 48 out, so it's very, very functional. All right, we're going to spend a few minutes going over the basic X32 layout. And I'm going to turn it over at this point to John DiNicola.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. And you'll see the first slide that we have coming up here when we talk about the interface and the layout of the X32 is discussing our motorized faders. It's definitely one of the features on the X32 that we're most excited about. And we really believe that to have a real digital board, you got to have motorized faders. And there's a few reasons why. These are definitely going to be, the main reason is going to be that you're going to be able to have a total recall. So when you load a preset, a scene preset, your fader levels will go right back where they need to go. But they also allow for some other really cool tricks that we're going to show later, such as sends on fader and GEQ on fader. And they even let you do some DAW control if you're using this in a studio environment. So let's take a look at how those faders are laid out. Joe gave us a brief overview earlier, so we're going to look in a little bit more. Starting on the left-hand side of the console are your 16 input faders. So remember, this is a 32 input console. Now we have 16 input faders. So in order to get to all of your inputs, we have what we call layers. So on the first layer, which is engaged, if you look at your photo on the right there, will be your first input channels, 1 through 16. So this is going to be Mike Pre's 1 through 16 out of the box, unless you change the routing. And then on the next page, 17 through 32. So right on those first two layers, accessible with dedicated buttons, is how you would get to your mix faders, 1 through 32. So very simple. And then on the third layer, right below that, are where your auxiliary inputs come in. The auxiliary inputs are actually 6 TRS balance connections on the back of the X32 that can be used for a variety of functions. And they come up right here on a third layer, along with the effects returns from your internal effects processors. So everything you need to mix is coming in on that left-hand side on those 16 faders on those layers. Then you move over to the right-hand side of the console where you have your output faders. So the first layer of the output faders are our DCA groups. The DCA groups are really handy, and they allow you to basically control the level of multiple channels with a single fader. So this is different than subgroups. As we'll see, subgroups we would use buses to do, and traditionally on maybe an analog board, you might have to have a few stereo subgroups just to get volume control. But if you don't need to do any processing on these channels, then you can just use a DCA and get a stereo group of channels on one fader. So that's the first layer. You have 8 DCAs. Right below that are going to be your bus masters for bus 1 through 8 on layer 2 and bus 9 through 16 on layer 3. And those are the master outputs for those buses. So if you have a floor wedge on monitor mix 1, then that first fader is going to be your master fader for that if it's on layer 2. And finally, on your fourth layer, you have access to your 6 matrix mixes and your mono center channel. And don't forget, at the very end, we have a 25th fader. That's a dedicated master fader. Okay, so now let's go into the channel strip of the X32. Joe also began to get into this a little bit. So above our faders, depending on, let's just say we're looking at 1 through 16, above our faders is our channel strip. So the first thing we'll see is that there's a dedicated mute and a solo button. And we also have our scribble strips, which we'll talk about a little more later, but these are really handy screens that will allow you to label your channels without tape, which is really handy. So basically, to engage the channel strip, you need to use the select button. So you'll become very familiar with this section at the top, and you'll see on your screen it's highlighted in blue. You want to make sure the first thing you do when you want to edit a channel, make sure you have it selected. That's going to be key for you. Once you have your channel selected, the channel strip on the upper left-hand side of the console becomes active for that channel. So let's take a look at that. Before we do that, I also want to mention, of course, I just skipped right over the fact that we do have metering above every fader. And it's not just an input meter, but it's actually going to show you if you have clipping going on. And there's also a light that shows you if your compressor's engaged and whether your gate is open or closed. So this is almost like having a meter bridge. It's kind of built right into this center of the console. Very handy. Of course, there they are, our dedicated mute and solo buttons. Okay, I want to take a second to talk about buses. In the past, engineers had to deal with aux sends and buses. On the X32, we're just referring to them as buses. So we have 16 buses, and because we're in a digital console, we can configure those 16 buses, as pre or post aux sends or as subgroups or whatever we need. But for the operation of the console, we're just going to be calling them buses. So as we said, there's 16 buses, and they're all assignable to be pre or post fader, or even pre or post EQ, and they also have subgroup mode. All bus mixes also have dynamics and EQ. As we stated, you can configure your 16 buses as buses or as subgroups, and there's actually a key difference. Buses are useful for combining signals to send to a certain source. So maybe you're sending to an effects processor in the desk, or maybe you're creating a monitor mix. This is when you would use buses, post fader for effects, pre fader for monitors. Subgroups are handy for a variety of other applications. Maybe you want to compress a group of drum channels, or you want to EQ a group of choir microphones. As we stated before, you wouldn't be able to do this with a DCA, since that's just the volume control, but you could create a subgroup, and you can work on that subgroup, with all the effects inside the console. In addition to those buses, we have the 8 DCAs, which we went over, and we have 6 matrix mixes. Matrix mixes on the X32, just like on most consoles, are going to be fed from a combination of subgroups. So if you're going to be using matrix mixes, you probably would have some subgroups, and the whole purpose of this would be it helps you create a really quick mix in a bind. So instead of having to create a mix out of 32 input channels, you can create a quick mix out of your subgroups. Very handy if you have to set up a quick feed for a video guy, or maybe you have an overflow room, at a house of worship service. Maybe it's a big service and you had to put a speaker out in the lobby where you have chairs set up. You can create a matrix mix really quickly, and you can process that with the 6-band parametric EQ and the dynamics, just like a mix bus. The bus faders also have some remote fader functions. As I mentioned earlier, with our motorized faders, we can incorporate multiple functions into the faders. So you'll be able to do GEQ on fader here. So if you're looking at your EQ plugin, you can simply just press the first encoder and engage GEQ on faders, and those 8 faders will be like a remote control for your EQ. And as we mentioned, those 8 faders are also capable of doing DAW control with Mackie or Huey emulation in remote mode if you're in the studio environment. Also included with the X32, we don't want to forget, is the 32 by 32 FireWire and USB 2.0 interface. This ships in the expansion slot of the X32. And this is a great chance for us to mention, this is an expansion slot, which is another really big thing with the X32 is expandability. So in the future, we're planning, there'll be some other digital I/O cards available, and there's other possibilities that we can have, but we are including a card with the console. So when you take your X32 out of the box, you'll see our FireWire USB interface. So this will allow you to do multi-track recording of all 32 channels, and it also allows you to play back 32 channels to do virtual sound checks or whatever your other needs, mixing in the console, using all the effects, whatever your needs may be.
Great, thanks for that, John. We're going to take a look now into the channel strip, the virtual channel strip on the X32. As I mentioned, the X32 has a really ergonomic design where you can get to everything you need to get to very quickly without searching through menus. Basically, this is the virtual channel strip, which is above our input fader section on the X32. And you'll notice that we have highlighted on each one of these little modules in the channel strip that there is a view button. So let's say, for instance, you go to your kick drum channel and you hit that select button on, say, channel 1, if that's your kick drum channel. The virtual channel strip above is going to be for the kick drum channel at that point. So we could hit view right now on, say, the EQ section, and we would immediately be brought to the EQ screen on the X32. Or if we were to hit one of the dynamics, the compressor section, we would immediately be pulled up to the compressor screen. The channel strip has an overview screen. It's called our home screen as well. And this is going to give us an overview of the complete signal flow for the selected channel. It works from left to right. So we have our input coming in. We can see if phantom power is on, if the phase is flipped. Then it hits our gate. We have a movable insert point. We have a direct out, the EQ module, dynamics, the final output with your left and right pan. And then there's all of your 16 buses for that particular channel. So at one glance, you could see if you're sending to any of those buses with that selected channel. All right, let's dig into that channel strip and actually go through the different modules that we have available. The most important stage, I feel, after the microphone, while you're still in the analog domain, is hitting that all vital mic preamp. And as we mentioned earlier, the X32 features Midas design mic pre's. So these are really great sounding, very transparent sounding mic pre's. And in your preamp module, you basically have your gain control. You have a phantom power on and off, and the phantom power is selectable on a per channel basis. It's not like one overall phantom power on switch. And there's also LEDs on the back where the actual XLR connections are to show you a little red LED if that particular channel also has phantom power. There is a variable high pass filter, which you can take in and out with that low cut switch, and right above it is the frequency. Okay, working our way down, we then have our dynamic section. We have our gate and our compressor limiter. What's nice is if you look at the actual encoders that we've selected to put on each of these different modules, it's the most common things that you need to get to quickly, particularly during a live show. A lot of times you do a quick sound check and you dial in maybe your attack and release on your compressor and your ratio. And then the show starts and the singer is singing much louder than they were at sound check or not as loud. So usually you're just, after you've dialed in your compressor, you might just be adjusting your threshold later on in the show. So bingo, there is a dedicated encoder knob for the threshold of the compressor. If you want to dig in deeper, you just reach down, you hit that view button, and you're into all the other parameters. Okay, let's take a look at our parametric EQ section. This is 4 bands of fully parametric EQ. If you look at the top graphic all the way on the right, you can select the different frequency ranges that you're working on within the EQ section. So we have a high, high mid, and low. And for whatever band group you're working on, you have a dedicated encoder for gain, frequency, and Q. And on the high and low band, you can set those to high or low shelving. And then on the high mid and the low mid, you also have a few different varieties basically on the Q shape of those particular bands. One being a more precise, tighter Q, and the other one being a little bit wider for more of a vintage style Q. So very, very active EQ section on the X32. Then we work our way over to our bus section. As John indicated earlier, we have 16 buses. We can use these for monitor sends. We could use these for effect sends, however we want them configured. And what's really cool on the X32 is that each individual bus send per channel is selectable pre or post fader. A few years ago, that was a function that was only found on some of the larger analog consoles. So it's very cool. It's very flexible on your busing. All right, we're going to turn this back over to John. He's going to be talking about a few things to make mixing a lot easier on the X32.
Great, thanks, Joe. And as Joe talked about earlier, we had a lot of help from our friends at Midas, our sister company, with the layout of the X32, with some certain things that really make mixing easier. And one thing we really are excited about bringing to the console are mute groups. Like Joe said, these are in the not many years ago. You might only find these on larger, expensive analog consoles, but here on the X32, you have 6 mute groups with dedicated controls positioned right by your right hand for easy access to any time. A couple examples where you might want to use a mute group. Maybe you have a group of microphones on stage for a horn section that comes on once or twice throughout the set. Well, you can assign those mics to a mute group, and you could have one-touch access to unmute those mics when they come on and turn them off when they get off. Another great example might be having all your effects returns on a mute group, so that when the singer's talking to the audience between the songs, they don't have any crazy delays or any other effects on their voice. So that's just a couple examples, but mute groups are very handy in a live setting. And again, you have 6 dedicated controls for those on the X32. We also have an assignable control section, again, right by your right hand above the mute groups. And this section features 4 rotary encoders and 8 buttons that can be programmed for easy access to many parameters on the X32. And you'll notice right below the 8 buttons, we have where it says set A, B, and C. That's basically, this is just like your faders where it works on layers. So you have 3 different layers of these controls, which really winds up giving you, 12 different encoders and 24 buttons that you can assign at any time. And because we have those different layers, we've actually included 4 extra scribble strips, between the rotary encoders and buttons that will, do the best they can to kind of tell you what you have those things assigned to. So as you flip between those 3 layers that you're using, again, you have, accurate labeling. So you always know what's going on.
John, a few kind of key things with some of these assigns. There's things that when you're mixing a live show, you might need to get really quickly to the lead singer's wedge. If I was assigning this, I'd probably assign rotary encoder number 1 for the lead singer's wedge. That would be the amount of their vocal mic going to their particular, might be bus 1 for their wedge. Another kind of cool one would be a tap tempo. You might want to just assign one of those bottom switches so that you could just tap on it and it'll flash in time to maybe for your delay time or whatever. Another one would be GEQ on fader. This is our graphic EQ that will use the bus faders as a remote control for the different frequency bands on your graphic EQ. So I just think, as you were explaining that, I was just thinking of a few different ways that I might personally use that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joe. And I also want to mention, I forgot to say before, that those controls can also be assigned to remote functions or MIDI. So
Oh
if you're
yeah, good
using
point.
yeah, if you're using it in a studio environment and you want to have a dedicated control section or transport section, you can set that up. And the best part is you have 3 layers, so you can actually just use 1 out of your 3 layers for your transport, and you'd be all set. Next, we have no more tape, and that's because we have the LCD scribble strips on the X32 right above every fader. So again, as you're flipping through layers, you're always going to have a label that shows you what channel you're on, and a picture if you choose to use one. You also have the option not to use a picture if you're having trouble again with the small text, and then you'll get a bigger text readout. So very flexible and really handy to keep everything straight when you're working in layers. And it's really nice. I mean, when you reload a new scene, you don't have to worry about relabeling the console. Everything just comes right up for you. The X32 also has some really extensive delay functions, and we're talking about input and output delays, not so much the effects. We'll get into that later, but definitely worth mentioning that you can delay any input on the X32 and by a range of 0.3 to 500 milliseconds, and the same actually goes for all the analog outputs. So you might delay an input if you are to time align some microphones. Maybe you have some close mic for mics above a choir, and then you have a close mic, and you want to align those. You can also use for analog outputs, of course. You might want to time align speakers in a large venue. But we also included delay on the monitoring section, which I thought was really neat because that gives you the ability to delay your headphone mix. So if you're sitting 100 feet, from the stage at front of house, you can, time align your headphones so that you're hearing, exactly what the audience is hearing, which is pretty neat. So now I want to get into the effects section on the X32. Joe went over the channel strip before, and we do have dynamics and 4-band parametric EQ on every channel. But in addition to that, we have an 8 stereo space effect rack built right into the X32, so you can really leave your effects processing rack behind. So let's take a look at that. The virtual effects rack, as I said, features 8 true stereo effects slots. Now, we're including more than just, this is not just reverbs and delays and EQ, but we really went over the top with this. I mean, there's over 40 plugins in the X32, featuring some other cool things such as a wave designer, which is a really neat plugin, kind of similar to the SPL transient designer, or a rotary speaker, or pitch shifting, or guitar amplification. So there's really a whole studio's worth of effects right inside the X32.
Yeah, it's really amazing when you look at just the sheer number of effects in the X32. I know another popular digital mixing board at roughly the same price point, the Presonus Studio Live. I was surprised the first time I got on one and realized that it only offered reverbs and delays. And as John indicated, I mean, 40 effects processors is pretty tremendous.
Absolutely. And again, with the 8 slots, you have enough power to run, 4 stereo reverbs while still running 831 band EQs. So let's take a look at how one might do that. Your typical live effects rack might consist of a vocal reverb, a drum reverb, a long delay, maybe a short delay or chorus or some other time domain effect, a stereo house graphic EQ, and then maybe 4 or more graphic EQs for your monitor mixes. Again, the X32 is going to feature all of this right inside the box. So now we see how that actually happens. This is the home screen on the effects section where you see your 8 slots, and they are divided up into 2 groups. On the left-hand side are going to be your send-return effects. These are the effects that you're going to send to on a bus. So basically, you want to say you have your vocal reverb set up and you have 3 singers. You're going to use one of your mix buses. If it's out of the box, it'll be fed by bus 13 on the first slot. And you just start sending those vocals one at a time to that effects processor and create a little mix for the reverb. And then the reverb processor will return on your 3rd input layer, as we showed earlier. So that's going to happen. That's how the first 4 slots work. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see 4 more slots that say insert above them. And that's because these are for insert only. So this is where you're going to want to put insertable effects, such as a precision limiter, or our graphic equalizers, or even a dual guitar amp simulation. It's also worth noting here that you can do inserts on all 8 slots. So if you wanted to put more graphic EQs in a monitor console scenario and wind up with everything filled with EQ, you could do 16 31-band graphic EQs. So with the EQs, I keep saying that you can have 4 stereo reverbs and 8 effects or 8 graphic EQs going at the same time. So I just want to explain that. Remember that these are stereo slots, so you have 2 choices on the graphic EQ. So you can use a stereo graphic EQ module, and that would be great for inserting on your left-right main mix. And that would, of course, use a whole slot because it's stereo and it's processing left and right, 2 channels. Your other scenario might be monitor mixes, which are going to most likely be mono, especially if they're feeding a wedge. And if you're doing a monitor mix, you can insert a mono or dual graphic EQ, and that's basically going to be fed on. You'll see to the left of that module, there's the letter B, and that's just indicating that the screenshot was taken from the B page. So if you're actually looking at the screen, you'd be able to use the layer button up and down to switch between A and B. And then, of course, you could feed, one mix bus into A and another mix bus into B. giving you 2 EQs on one channel. So that's how we get the 8 31-band graphic EQs coming out of 4 slots. Another thing with the X32 that I just want to mention is that we have the total recall. So we have 100 scenes on the board, and you can save more on USB stick. The scenes are easily accessible with dedicated buttons on the console. This is key because this makes it very simple to, without going through menus, you can use the previous and next buttons to kind of queue up your next scene. You'll actually, in the very upper left-hand corner of the screen, if you're looking at an X32, you'll actually notice as you use the previous and next buttons, the little text, not the big number, but the one underneath, will change. And then if you would hit go, then it would go to that scene. So really great to have those dedicated controls so that you can jump between scenes fast.
Thanks, John. I wanted to just take a few minutes and go over a few of the peripheral products that go along with the X32. And I want to point out that the X32 is part of a growing ecosystem of products. So in the coming months, you're going to see a number of new products that all work in perfect harmony with that AES-50 port on the back of the X32. Probably one of the most common add-ons is going to be the S16 stage box. This is basically a 2 rack space unit, and if you look at the graphic on the bottom, this is showing the front, and then right below it, the back of the S16. If we start at the top graphic on the left-hand side, we have 16 XLR inputs, which are feeding 16 of those Midas Design mic pre's right inside of this 2 rack space unit. Now, these are the same mic pre's that are built into the X32. And in this scenario, you would basically be placing this, say, on your stage and running a Cat5 wire from your front of house position to this first S16 box. And then you would configure the X32 to remotely control these 16 mic pre's inside of the S16. Few advantages there are your mic pre's are now located within 15 to 30 feet of all of your microphones on the stage. You're no longer running down that 100, 200 foot long copper snake anymore and degrading signals. So this is a much cleaner way to do this. Not to mention simple Cat5 wire. You plug it in on one click on the X32 at front of house position, one click at this S16. And at the end of the night, you're not winding up a huge 32 by 16 snake, which weighs a ton. Or at the beginning of every show, you're not standing there and plugging that all into the back of the console and then having to deal with the separate snake head and all that. So as I said, on the left, you have your 16 XLR ins going to your 16 Midas Design mic pre's. On the right, you have 8 XLR outputs. So these are going to be basically used to drive any of our speakers, whether it's going into a processing rack that's feeding all your front of house speakers, or going to any of your floor wedges for different mixes on the stage, or possibly to anything else that you'd want to drive from the X32. Right above that, there's another section which allows you to monitor directly from the S16. So you have a headphone jack with a monitoring level. So let's say you're doing a show all by yourself and you don't have an additional stagehand to do a traditional line check. You could just, from the stage, solo any of your inputs or outputs to double check how you have everything patched on the stage. As we go to the back of the S16, starting from the left to right, we have a USB input, which is basically going to allow us to do future firmware upgrades if we need to update anything in the S16. You have the 2 AES ports right beside that, the A and the B port. So in the scenario which I mentioned earlier, you run that single Cat5 wire from front of house down to your first S16, maybe plug that into the A port, take the B port with a small little jumper Cat5 wire, and maybe go up to a second S16 to get a full 32 by 16 out of 2 S16s. So very, very flexible system that you have with that AES-50. Another possible option would be to take this and then maybe feed out to a monitor console. So you can really grow this into whatever size system that you need using that all critical AES-50 port. Right beside that, you have an Ultranet jack. This is another Cat5 connection. And this is going to connect. In the next slide, we're going to be going over the P16 system. This would directly connect to that system, to the P16 16-channel discrete monitoring system. Right beside this is an ADAT output. We have 2 ports here, 2 ADAT ports, and this is going to give us 1 through 8 and 9 through 16. And you can just look at these as direct outs for that bank of 16 mic pre's inside of the S16. Now, in a scenario where, let's say, at your front of house position, you decided to pull out the recording card, the FireWire, and the USB card, and maybe you needed to put some other card in that slot and it wasn't available. Well, no problem. If you have the S16, you can use these to feed a recording rig. Maybe you've got a Pro Tools rig that's got an ADAT interface or whatever, and you could just take these ADAT outs and feed into that recording system. Or I know commonly radar systems are also commonly used in live environments, so you could just feed that right into a radar system. The MIDI ports right beside this, we have an in and an out, and this is basically going to allow you to remote control with a MIDI controller, something like maybe our BCR 2000, where you could then use that to remote control any of the parameters in the S16. Number one question we tend to get on the S16s are, when are they shipping? It's you buy your X32 and it's just logically the next piece of gear that you'd want to add to your system. And I've been told that these should be shipping by around the end of November. So very soon we'll start to see these in the marketplace. Okay, I mentioned the PowerPlay, the P16 system. This is connecting to that Ultranet jack on the back of either the S16, or if you don't have an S16, there's also a redundant jack on the back of the X32. So let's say you're in a recording studio environment, you have your X32 in the control room, and you just run a single Cat5 wire out of that Ultranet port on the back out to your various P16 pieces. A typical scenario is we make a unit called the P16D, D for distribution. Typically, you would go into one of those, and it takes a single Ultranet connection, and it turns it into 8 outputs. So you could, with a single Cat5 wire, you go into a P16D, and then you could feed 8 of these little P16M mixer stations. So how this works is each musician would get a P16M, as we have on the screen here, and it just shows you the 16 channels that are coming into the P16 system. On the X32, the way you have to look at this is a dedicated 16 buses just for your personal monitoring system. So it's kind of like it's really more like a 32 bus console when you take into account that there's a separate 16 buses just for personal monitoring. So basically, those 16 channels would be coming in on the bottom. It's going to show you a green indicator flashing, for signal coming into that particular channel. The channel 3 is red, indicating that channel 3 is selected, and then the various encoders on the top are used to control that particular channel. Let's say that's our lead vocal channel on channel 3, and then we could pan it. We could have a separate level control for that. For each input, you have a full 3-band EQ. You have basically a fixed bass and treble, and then you have a sweepable mid. You have a built-in limiter and a level on the output. You can even store 16 mixes on the store and recall buttons. You can link stereo channels together. You can group, say, a whole group of drum channels together and group it all into one after you have your mix all set up. So very, very flexible system at an absolutely unheard of price point to get into a 16-channel discrete monitoring system. Applications for this would be obviously in a recording studio. Every musician, if you're recording a rhythm section, would want a P16M. In the live environment, I could see any musicians that are using in-ear monitors. On the back of this, you have a line left and right output that you could feed into a wireless in-ear transmitter, and then you could totally dial your own mix in personally from the stage. So that is our PowerPlay P16 system. All right, let's take a quick look at how all these pieces go together. Here we have our typical theater setup. At our front of house position, we've got our X32. You can see on the back of it, we have our 32 mic inputs if we wanted to use the internal mic pre's. We have 16 outputs, and then our various connections along the bottom, such as AES 50, MIDI, etc. In our scenario, let's say we've got a pair of S16s, so we don't have to deal with any of that analog connectivity. We are basically going to take a single Cat5 wire. And this is standard Cat5 that you could buy at, pretty much any Radio Shack or Home Depot. You run that down to the stage, you plug it into the bottom S16, you take the through port and you go up to the other, or actually the B port, and you go up to the other S16. So we're utilizing a full 32 in by 16 out with two of these. On the back of the first X16, we have that Ultranet connection, and I had mentioned the P16D distribution box. So bingo, we go into that first input, and that gives us 8 outputs to feed up to 8 musicians. So let's say this is the lead singer, and maybe that's the rhythm guitarist standing there next to them, taking the line outs, and we're going into maybe powered wedges. We want to go that route rather than in-ear monitors. And bingo, we've got a complete system just using the X32, a couple of S16s, a P16D, and a couple of P16Ms.
Yeah,
All
Joe,
right.
and I wanted to clarify, if you don't mind, just that the difference about using the P16D, the major benefit to the D, besides cleaning up your cable runs, is that if you run a direct line from a P16M to a D, you're going to have a powered output from the P16D.
Great point.
Meaning that you're not going to have to plug in the wall wart. Now, of course, that is included with the P16M, but it isn't the most convenient solution. So by adding the hub, you get those powered outputs. But if you don't want to use the hub, you can still plug you can still plug a P16 into the P16 output on the X32 with the S16. So it's very flexible in that matter.
Yeah, really great point. I mean, I've already seen pictures on a few of the forums. Somebody was showing where they took a P16D and they mounted it into a 19-inch rack panel, which you can do. And, I could see people just screwing those right into, their stage rack that's got a couple of S16s and then that P16D there. So, yeah, great point. The power, I think, is really important. I've done so many shows in my life where at the end of the night, the less cable you have to wind up, the better. I mean, every minute you save is just that much sooner you get home at the end of the night. So great time saver. All right, I wanted to go on now and talk about our 3-year warranty. This is really exciting. About 8 months ago, I think it was about 8 months ago at the NAMM show, we announced a 3-year warranty. We had a 1-year warranty for quite a while. We added an additional, it's basically a 1+2 warranty. So you do need to register your product after you buy it to get the additional 2 years. But we were able to do this for a number of reasons. It says here quality, reliability, service. And I wanted to talk for a second how we got there. Behringer, starting about 3 years ago when we acquired Midas, Uli was saying that he was talking to the Midas people about what it would take to manufacture anything for Midas in our existing factory in China. And Midas came back with a wish list. And basically, the wish list had a $20 million price tag on it. And Uli went for it. We've invested $20 million into our factory to manufacture at the level that they needed. With this $20 million, we invested in an additional $8 million just in new automation machinery in the factory. We also did things like we made the largest purchase of audio precision test equipment ever in the history of audio precision. So with this $20 million investment with better machinery, better testing capabilities, the good news is that not only are we able to manufacture at Midas quality, but also the quality of Behringer products came way up as a result of it. And we were basically able to say, hey, our products have really significantly improved, and we can now offer a 3-year warranty. I always tell people when I bring this up, don't take our word for it. I would say go to Taman's website. Taman is the largest Behringer dealer, I think pretty much globally at this point. And they've been, over the past 3 years, basically, if you look at the graphic on the right, if you look at the bottom figure, the bottom green arrow, Over the past 3 years, in real time, they track failure rates of all the different brands that they sell. And here it is. We have a 0.77%. That's less than 1% failure rate on the Behringer product line. I can tell you that many other major brands are well over this range. I mean, there's several manufacturers that are in the 3% range. So, like I said, don't take our word for it. Working for the company, if you wanted to, you could call Tom and verify those figures. While we're talking about the 3-year warranty, I wanted to talk just a second about service. And like I said, myself as a former sound company owner and a live engineer and studio engineer, I get it. I mean, you can't be without your console. You can't be down missing shows, especially on, a $3,000 console. We're really going out of our way with this product. We don't want to let you down. We've done things in addition to that huge investment in the factory. We've purchased a whole facility in Las Vegas where it's Midas, Clark Technic, and Behringer, all within one building as far as U.S. service. We're doing the same thing in England right now. So at our Las Vegas facility, if you happen to be in the U.S., this 702 number will get you directly into our techs in our service center. You hit option 1 to get tech support. You'll be prompted for that, but just hit option 1. I personally don't even have a direct number myself. When I call in, I have to hit option 1, and every time I've called in so far, I've gotten through to a tech within a matter of minutes. So it's not, you're not going to be waiting all day to get through to somebody. I want to mention a key player with the X32, a guy named Chase McKnight. If it's related to the X32, ask for Chase. Chase is going to know. He knows the thing inside and out. And what we're finding with the X32 is it's a very sophisticated product. And sometimes people think they have a service issue, and it might have just been a simple routing issue. There's very extensive routing in the X32. You can even reroute channels internally. So sometimes some of the service calls we're getting are more user error. So Chase would be able to figure that out for you. If it's an operational issue, my name, Joe Sanborn. Here is my email address. John, the other presenter on the call, here is his direct email address. Please get in touch with us. We know what it's like out there, and we're trying to get everybody helped as quick as possible. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to John. John is going to be going through some tips and tricks that we've learned in the time that we've been using the X32. So take it away, John.
All right, thank you, Joe. The first thing I'm going to show you guys is not necessarily a trick, but it might be the most common question I'm asked, and that is how to name the channel strips. You see we have some beautiful LCD screens here, and everybody wants to know right away how we can change the colors. So the first thing you want to do is, and I'm going to explain 2 ways to do this. This is the original way, and no matter what X32 you walk up to, this will work. So we select the channel. Let's say we want to change this first guitar channel here. I'm going to select it. Now I need to be in the config screen, so I'm going to get there very quickly by pressing View by the preamp. And you'll notice that it says config/preamp. So there's some other options in that menu besides the mic preamp gain, and this is one of them. So we'll press View. And when you see the configuration screen, then you can go over by your screen and press the utility button. Once the utility button has been pressed, you have the new menu, and you can use your rotary encoders, as I'm doing now, to change your colors, your pictures, pick between some predetermined some pre-typed labels we made for you to make things easier, or you can go ahead and type in your own name. Now, starting on firmware, I believe 1.08, if you have an updated console, we made this a little easier for you, where all you have to do is press the select button and hold it, and press utility, and that'll work on your DCA groups or any input channel or output channel. So that's really pretty neat. So remember, if you did get an X32, don't forget to update your firmware to make that easier, as well as have a lot of other improvements as well.
You know what, John? That's a really great point, and it's something we should really stress to everybody, is definitely be on top of updating your firmware on your X32. It's vitally important. And it couldn't be easier. Basically, you go to Behringer.com, you go to the X32 product page. You'll see it right on the the main screen. You just click on that X32 image, and when you get to the X32 landing page, basically in the center section, there is going to be a downloads area, and any firmware upgrades, whether it's to the X32 itself or to the iPad app or the X Control PC app, basically those are all going to be listed under that download. So you just go to whatever the latest firmware is, you click on the file, it downloads to your computer. You take a USB stick that you could pretty much buy at, any Staples or Office Max or wherever you get your sticks from. And one key thing is make sure that the stick is formatted for FAT32. And there's plenty, if you just type in FAT32 on Google, there's many instructions on how to do that. It's very easy. You can do it from the desktop of your computer. And then you just drag that firmware download to the stick, take the stick out of your computer, stick it in the top slot on the X32, and turn the X32 on. And if it finds a firmware, the first thing it does during boot up is if it finds a newer firmware on the USB stick, it just automatically does the update function. And that only takes, about 45 seconds, John? It's a pretty quick operation.
Yeah, and it's really easy and equally important. So thank you, Joe, for bringing that up.
Sure.
So moving on from there, the next thing I want to show you is copy paste. When you're setting the X32 up for the first time for a particular show, this can be a real time saver. And we have that feature throughout the console. So let's use the example of an EQ. So let's say we're going to select a channel on our console, maybe our guitar, and we're going to press view by the EQ. And we're going to dial in a couple of boosts here and cuts. And this is just for the purpose of showing you guys the copy paste, so that'll be good enough. And so now let's say this is my EQ for my guitar, and I want this on all my guitars, not just this guitar. So I can press utility right next to the screen there as I move my camera. And when you press utility, you have the option to not only you can actually save and load presets here, but you also have on the last two encoders copy and paste. So all you have to do is press the fifth encoder to copy it, and you'll see my paste is lit up over there on the right now. So now it's telling me I have something on my clipboard. And now I can select my other guitars, and I can just say paste with my sixth encoder. And now my EQ has been pasted, from one guitar to the other. Really convenient. This can also be done on a channel strip basis. So let's say you got a whole channel strip set up, and you have your EQ and compression and gate dialed in. Toms might be a great example of this. You got Tom 1 all dialed in, and you want the whole channel strip. To do this, just press the home button, and then do the exact same procedure. When you're looking at the whole channel strip, if you hit utility, you have the same options to save a preset, load a preset, of course, and then copy and paste. So you just say copy, select another Tom, and paste it, and say yes, and you copied the whole channel strip. So that could be a great time saver for you when you're setting up a gig. The next thing I want to show you guys is going to be a couple of things that have to do with buses. The first thing is the global configuration. Joe talked about earlier, I think we both did, about how the buses on the X32 can be configured as pre-post fader, pre-post EQ, or as subgroups. And it can be done on a per channel basis. Doing it per channel is easy enough. You can select the channel, press view near the bus sends, and then using my layer button, I can access different settings for my buses, but that's on a per channel basis. So let's just say you're just getting the console set up and you know right off the bat that your first 8 buses are going to be pre-fader because you're doing 8 monitor mixes. You probably don't want to have to do that, 8 different mixes times 32 channels. That can take quite a bit of time. So to save that time, we're going to select a bus. So we're going to use the bus layer right here. We'll select buses 1 through 8. And we're going to select the actual bus, just like we would select a channel. And my hand's going off the screen, but I'm pressing view by the config, that same spot by the mic preamp we've been using earlier. And the third rotary encoder is actually going to be able to switch the bus to the pre-post fader, pre-post EQ, or subgroup. And by doing it this way, you've now changed it for that entire bus. So that's how you can set it globally, to save you some time. We actually also have some default configurations on the second page of our setup menu on the config page. If you click setup and hit config, we actually have some pre-configured configurations. So if one of those works for your setup, then you can instantly change everything globally. So very flexible, and we try to also make it very easy. The next thing I'd like to show you, and I mentioned this earlier, it's one of my favorite things about the X32, and that's going to be sends on fader. So basically, we went over that you can use the bus not fader or the bus encoders in the channel strip, kind of like you would do on an analog console, and you can use the encoders to do your mix. But I think this is a much easier way of doing it. If you select the sends on fader button and you engage that, and then you choose a mix bus. So I'm choosing, mix bus 1. Now all my faders on the left, where my hand is now, is controlling the mix to that actual bus. And it's probably hard to see, but right next to the channel, it actually says, channel 14 to bus 1, because that's what I have selected. So let's say I have my monitor mix for, my first monitor mix is all dialed in. Now I can press 2, and my motorized faders jump right to 2, and then I can configure that mix. And again, the scribble strip will show me that I'm configuring bus 2's mix. So just a really nice advantage to having motorized faders. And this is a pretty typical feature on some other analog consoles, but we took it a step further, and we kind of gave you another way to work it. So I showed you, sends on fader engage, and you're selecting a bus. The other way to do it is to select a channel. And if you do that, let's select the guitar here, then your 8 faders on the right are going to be the bus send to that bus. So let's say right now this fader right here is bus 1. So this is the same as the rotary encoder for bus 1. In fact, you'll notice the encoder is changing as the fader changes, or even cooler, I can make the fader move by moving the encoder. So depending on how you want to work, you have 3 different ways you can send to buses, which is pretty awesome. Next thing I'd like to talk about is channel patching. It's a little advanced configuration. Joe mentioned that you can patch any channel around internally, which I think is a great feature. So let's just say we want to move our channel 7 here that I have selected. We want to move it over and have it come up on channel 11. So actually what we're going to do is, since 11 is the channel we want it to come onto, we're going to select 11. And we're going to press View by the config screen. Again, this is a really handy area. We keep coming back here again to the config screen. And now on the config screen, on the last encoder, you'll see a menu. Or actually, I'm sorry, on the third encoder, you'll see a menu. I'm pointing at it right now. And it says Source. So this will allow you to choose any channel to bring into that, to bring in any inputs, bring into that channel, I should say. It also gives you the option to bring in effects returns. So maybe you want to do some advanced processing on your effects returns with dynamics and EQ and everything. You can bring, if you have some extra channels on the X32, you can bring your effects returns into a normal channel, like many used to do on analog consoles. Also, from the same menu is where you would set up your inserts. So you can insert any internal effect, but I mentioned you have those 6 auxiliary ins and outs, and some of you might be wondering what you can use those for. Let's say you have a really neat compressor, maybe you got a distressor or an 1176 or something that you want to use. You can connect it to those balanced ins and outs on the back, those TRS ins and outs, and then you can select on the insert that AUX to be an insert. So it's almost effectively like giving you an insert point. We weren't able to include inserts on every channel, and we don't think you need them with all the processing in the X32. But you do have that flexibility, so you can get your favorite pieces of outboard gear, connected still. So it's kind of like having the best of both worlds. And again, you're going to find both of those options in the config screen. You can get to there from scrolling to it on your left and right page selects, or by pressing View near the mic preamp config screen. Next thing I want to talk about is scenes versus shows. And I'm going to zoom in a little on my screen, so bear with me here. All right. So I talked about how there's 100 scenes on the X32. One important thing to realize when you're doing scenes on the X32 is the difference between scenes and shows. So let's get into the scene menu. To do that, we're just going to press the View button right in the scenes right by the scenes controls. It's right above the assign section. And that's the button I've just pressed, and you can see I have some scenes here in the console. And from here, you can use the rotary encoder, and you can select any slot and press down and save a scene. Okay, and you also have the ability, someone might ask, well, what if I want to export or import? So you can do that actually by pressing the utility button. And that will reveal import scene or import show. Now, this is a very important difference. When you export files to the USB stick, you can export a scene on the first menu here, right here, save settings directly to USB. And that's, again, only if you have the latest firmware. So you've got to get that updated, as Joe described. Or you can export a whole show. So if you export a whole show and then you import a show, it's going to take any scene you have on the console and overwrite that. Okay, so you want to make sure that's what you want to do. If you just want to bring in one particular scene, then make sure you choose the import scene. So I like to bring that up. It's a really important distinction, but also a great feature. It makes it simple. If you need more than 100 scenes, maybe you're doing a theater production, you have the ability to drop a new show onto the console, maybe during intermission, and then, bam, there's your 100 more scenes. So you have those options when it comes to scenes. I mentioned earlier that there are input and output delays on the X32. The input delays, you're going to find those on the handy config screen. So again, you're going to press view by the config area or the mic preamp gain. And right between those two menus that we talked about earlier is our delay. So we can dial that in, and then we can press the encoder to actually engage it. Okay? On the output side, if you want to delay an output, you actually have to do that from the routing menu. So I'm going to press routing. I'm going to go move over one page to my analog outputs. And you'll notice while I'm here, this is a really cool thing to mention, is that all the XLR outputs on the back of the X32 are individually assignable. So out of the box, outputs 1 through 14 are going to be mixed 1 through 14, and then 15, 16 are named left, right. But of course, you can configure this however you like. And that's also done on this screen. But you'll notice on the very right-hand side, the last encoder, again, you have a delay control measured in feet and meters and also milliseconds, and then you can engage that delay for that particular output. And while I'm here, I'll also show you that if you press the view button on the monitor section, which you can see in my image here, you have the same delay control, only now on your third rotary encoder. So again, you can engage delay and press the encoder to engage it. So that's how you use your delays on the X32. All right, the next thing I would like to show is a fun one. We've talked extensively about mute groups and DCAs and how they can make your life easier. So we wanted to make them just as easy to work with. So how do you assign channels to a DCA? Well, the first thing you need to do is be on the DCA layer. So we're looking at buses from our other examples before. So let's click the DCA button. And now I see my DCAs. So I'm going to say this is my, so you can see them, this third DCA is for my guitars. And so you'll notice if I press and hold the select button above the guitar DCA group, oh, of course I haven't assigned them yet, which is perfect. So I'm going to hold this down. I'm just going to press the select button above the channels I want to add. Now you'll notice that I only had to press twice, and that's because it just so happens these guitar channels are linked in a stereo pair. But either way, you can add these in by pressing and holding on the select button of the DCA, and then pressing the channel select button. And then once you let go, those channels are assigned and you're all set. Mute groups is almost as easy. We just included one more step, and of course we don't want anybody accidentally muting anything in the middle of a live show. So here's how we do that. There's a mute group button near the screen. So you want to make sure, if you want to edit a mute group, or if you want to toggle them from the rotary encoders on the screen rather than the dedicated buttons, you press the mute group button by the screen so that it's lit up red or orange, as you can see here. Now, if I press a mute group button, nothing's going to mute because it's in edit mode. So if I press and hold down mute group 1, just like with DCAs, I can now individually add channels to that mute group. And now, in order to make that mute group work again, of course, I have to turn off the mute group edit mode. So I'll turn that off. Now I'm going to press 1, and as you can see, we just made our mute group, just like that. So 2 really convenient features and just as easy to work on.
Great, thanks for that, John. those are really some great tips and tricks on using the X32. We're basically at this point to the end of the presentation. We were just doing a whole overview on the X32. A few things I wanted to mention. This was a comparison sheet that we did, which is comparing the X32 to the Studio Live, to the Yamaha LS9, and also to the Allen and Heath GLD. And obviously, as you can see, the X32 has the lowest price point. But what is really startling is when you start to dig in to some of the specifics, when you start to compare the different boards as far as their feature set. And what John and I have discovered, as we started to dig into this stuff, is that even though the X32 has the lowest price point at under $3,000, its feature set is really more similar to the mixing boards that are close to $10,000. So it really is a tremendous value, and we can make this comparison sheet available if anybody wants a PDF copy of it. One other spec while we're on this, though, I just wanted to point out. Uli pointed out to me the last time we were together that the latency on the X32 is the lowest latency of any digital mixing board on the planet. It doesn't matter what the price point is. And if you go all the way down to the bottom where it says specs, the second spec down is latency, and that is 0.8 milliseconds of latency versus something like, say, the Studio Live is up at 3 milliseconds. So this is one of the reasons why we can, build something like the P16 personal monitoring system into the X32. That latency is super low. You're not going to have that nasty latency where, things are delayed in your phones or whatever. Obviously, the other ones are, 2.5, almost 2 milliseconds on the GLDs. So these are, it's all crucial stuff, but I just thought I would point that out to you just to demonstrate what a tremendous value the X32 is. So pretty much that concludes the presentation portion of our user group meeting. We're going to turn it over now to any questions that anybody had, either during the presentation or if you're holding back on something that you'd like to see us do on the X32, just type that into the questions area, and then we'll be doing those live demos for the next hour. So thank you very much. Somebody else was asking about the controlling a DAW, as a control surface, and currently it's implemented in that center section, and we're almost looking at it as the same way that you look at, say, you had a small bank of faders, like on a control surface. Basically, you use the bus faders for a bank of 8 input faders, and to control your DAW. So and what's nice about it is it's also located right next to your assign section. John, do you have that set up in Logic? Is that what you're doing, or?
I don't have Logic open right now because my computer it doesn't like parallels very much. But you get the idea that you might be able to see how the screens are showing, they say mute right now. And what that's telling me is that that's what it's telling you what your mute buttons are going to do. But depending on what layer you're on, as I just switched to this layer, now my mute buttons are actually transport. That says stop, that says play, and so on. So you have the select, the solo, the mute buttons are all mappable. And as Joe mentioned, you have your assign control section right here. So now I'm going to switch back to X control. Oh, they haven't gotten that part in the X control yet. My mistake. But what I was going to show you is that in X control, or in the assign section, there's a very easy way to assign the transport functions to those particular controls.
So we're getting
view.
I'm sorry, were you done, John?
No, yeah, go ahead.
I just was going to mention we're getting a few questions on the iPad app and also on the X Control software. We are definitely going to have a native Mac version of it. Somebody was asking, when we might have that. Right now, most of our bandwidth has been just getting the X32 out to the market, providing the initial versions of X Control and also the iPad app, and they're only going to get dialed in over the coming months. But I do think that the Mac version of the X Control is probably after we have the iPad app fully dialed in. That seems to be the number one request that we're getting. And also, due to the fact that so many X32s are being used out in the live world, where it has to be right, we're focusing on getting firmware updates out almost immediately. I mean, I think we're almost coming out with one a week. I know 1.10 is going to be coming out sometime in the next 10 days. So we're addressing anything that comes up as fast as possible. And that gets into another area, which is firmware updates. If you own an X32, I encourage everybody to just check the product page on the Behringer.com site. Just go to the, right on page 1, you'll see the X32. Just click on it. In the middle of the page, there's an updates tab. Just go there and check it maybe once a week, and any of those firmware upgrades. It literally takes under 5 minutes. You just download this little tiny file. You copy it onto a USB stick, a FAT32 formatted USB stick, and then you just put it into the X32 with the power off, and then power the X32 on. It'll do the firmware upgrade automatically for you, and it's done in a matter of, I think it takes about 45 seconds. A few other things I want to just get into. People have been asking a lot of questions about the USB slot in general. It's really encouraged that you're at least at 1.09 if you're doing anything with the USB stick slot. We corrected a few issues that were there. One of them was if you forgot to stop recording and it filled the stick up, it would dump the file and not automatically save it. So that was corrected. And if you're using the USB stick slot for any type of recording, I really encourage everybody to try your sticks out, before your gig. Make sure that it's recording and working properly. This isn't an X32 problem. It's a USB stick problem. It's more of a mass market price type product where even if you find 1 week Lexmark USB sticks work fine for you, you buy the same exact one a week later, and that one doesn't work. And it's just a matter of the manufacturers changing production in the middle and changing the spec on their stick. And so I just encourage you to format your sticks when you buy them for FAT32 format, and try them ahead of time of your gigs, and you should be good to go on that. All right, I'm just going to take a second.
Someone just saw a question on the bottom about, let's see. Someone was just asking about sending matrix mix, doing a matrix mix and sending it out to a delay stack, and I can actually show you that really quickly. Basically, your matrix mixes are built from subgroups. So you would just select a subgroup channel. So let's say you got to be on the bus section here. And right now my buses are set up for vocal wedges, but let's pretend that they were set up as subgroups, and on channel 1, I had my I had the first, what I want. If I go to the home screen with a bus selected, and I go to sends, you'll notice that now you only have 6 sends, and that's because buses are getting not sent to other buses, but they get sent to matrices. So you build your matrix mixes by selecting a bus channel, and then using this bus send knobs, 1 through 6, of course, since you only have 6 matrices. Once you've built those matrix mixes, on the routing menu, you would go to analog out, choose your output, and one of your categories is matrix, so you would just choose that matrix mix, and then for your delay, you would just set the delay value, engage the delay, and it's as simple as that.
So John, just back up for a second. You went through that pretty quick. Starting on the left is your physical output, and then just slowly work your way back across again.
Sure. Starting on the left is the physical output. So let's say we want to send this matrix out output 1. So I select output 1. The next area is a category. This is really just a shortcut. It just jumps you in the list of
So you can just select matrix here. Now for my output signal, I can select. I have, matrix 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So I select the matrix. Then you want to select the tap. You actually, I didn't mention before, but you do have the ability to tap that matrix post-fader or pre-fader, or post-EQ, pre-EQ. So you would choose that, and then finally you could set your delay and engage or disengage it.
So it's really, really ultra flexible. I mean, it's very easy to set up too. I mean, it's all right there. You just work left to right.
Somebody asked about running X control using USB since most don't have FireWire. Just want to clear up a little confusion. The X control software can run on USB or Ethernet, and those are actually dedicated jacks. That USB jack is a separate jack than the USB jack for the recording card. So it's two separate things here. You have Ethernet and USB for X control, and that's for controlling the desk with the computer. And then you have a separate USB or FireWire for actually recording audio. And I also want to mention, excuse me, that since we are on version 0.7, so I don't believe USB has been added into X Control yet. So if you want to try the new X Control, the Ethernet solution is the way to go for now.
John, we're getting a question to show about saving scenes.
Okay, so to save a scene, you have to go to the Scenes menu. The only way to get there is to press View near the Scene section, the dedicated Scene section on the console. It's actually laid out very similar to the way you see on my screen. So you press View, and then you would use the first rotary encoder to select an actual scene. Of course, I can do it with my mouse here. So you would select the slot, and then you would just press Save Settings. Now here on my screen, you actually see where I have a Save Settings to Scene or Save Settings to File. On the X32, with the latest firmware, you'll see instead of File, you'll have the option to save a scene directly to USB, which is a new feature that I really think is pretty handy. So yeah, you would just select the slot that you want to use, Save Settings to Scene. We'll name the scene. Let's name it X32. And you can press Save, and then you'll see in that slot I now have the X32 scene. In this same menu, if you want to get to USB, you can press Utility, and that's where you'd be able to import shows or scenes from USB or export the whole show to USB.
Cool. We just got a question. Somebody was asking about on the iPad apps, sort of where that's going. I know right now, like I said, we're trying to add features to it, as quick as possible, as well as doing all of the firmware upgrades. But eventually, the iPad app is pretty much it's going to control everything on the board, including the preamp gains, which I know that's. And if I mention any other manufacturers, I'm not putting anyone down. I just know that the Studio Live, the Persona Studio Live, is in a similar price point. So I'm not saying anything bad about it. I'm just saying I know that that's one thing that they can't do is the preamp gain, and we're going to integrate that even into the iPad app as well. So pretty much you're going to be able to get to most everything on the X32 once it's all dialed in. Somebody also is asking about permissions. This is a key feature, and I want to mention that we just hired a guy who's going to be our House of Worship product specialist, and I've been working with him quite a bit on what in the House of Worship market, what are they looking for? I know it's really important. Usually you have one guy in the congregation who kind of is the sound guy, and then he might not be able to make it there on Wednesday night when the choir is rehearsing, and yet they still might need to maybe play back a CD or maybe control a couple of mics that they need. And so we're looking into that right now as far as how we're going to lock out different sections. So possibly different users. Maybe they can only get to input bank 1, and they can only control level. They can't change any of the channel settings, stuff like that. So we're working that out in regards to lockouts on the board. I mean, another biggie is obviously, I don't know about you guys, but as a live guy, I would never hand a musician an iPad app where he had the possibility of turning up the master fader that was going out to the audience. So like different things like that. Obviously, we're going to have different lockout solutions coming. Somebody was just asking about on the input side of the board where I've talked about layer 3, where you have those aux ins. So you have those inputs for the 6 sets of aux inputs on the back.
Yes.
And then there's USB left and right. This is basically a tape return because the USB stick. Wow.
Yeah,
Sorry, guys.
it's raining in California.
In Los Angeles, there's a flash flood warning going off on my phone, so sorry about that. Yeah, the USB stick basically is like a 2-track recorder, so it needs to return somewhere where you can control the level of it. So that's where it says USB left and right. You could play back from that memory stick.
Yeah, you guys can see it on my screen now. I saw another question from Mike Gibson about in the P16 out, you don't seem to be able to select aux 1 through 8 out. And you actually can select, and I think what you're referring to the mix buses, and you certainly can choose that. But you also do have the option to do a direct out of aux 1 through 6. I believe. Actually, you do have the option to direct out aux 1 through 8. I'll actually show it to you right here. On routing P16 output, if you were talking about the mix bus, you have the 16 mix buses right here. And then down at the bottom, under the direct out area, is where you have the direct out to those 8 aux ins. So yes, you can assign those to the P16.
Got a question from Nick Davis about possibility of assigning transport control when not using the remote DAW feature.
The transport control, well, that would just be a MIDI function under the assign section, right? That's how I would.
Yeah, guys. Actually, if you press, let me go to my camera for this. This is actually pretty cool. 1 second. So if you press View by the assign control, I can't show this in X control, so I'm going to do the best I can with the screen here with my camera on a mic stand.
Our high-tech setup here.
So now you can see I have set A. So, and as you can tell, it's a cheap mic stand because it keeps going down. But very quickly, I'll go to set A, and you have an option for remote right here. And since I have an encoder selected, I can select the parameter of jog wheel, and I've now made my first encoder a jog wheel. Likewise, I can select a button, select remote, and you'll see, probably can't read too well, but I have all my transport functions such as stop, play, nudge left, right, record. Those can all be assigned to the buttons as well. So it's as simple as that. You just need to have your remote setup configured. To do that, actually, while I'm here, if you click on setup and you page to the right over to remote, this is where you would get set up. So using Logic, I recommend Mackie Control. I believe, Joe, you've had success with Huey on Pro Tools. But
Yes.
both should work. And so you just want to make sure this is set up. You want to tell it to use whatever protocol. You want to tell it to use the either the card MIDI, if you want to use the USB or FireWire cable, or MIDI I/O if you want to use an actual MIDI cable. So once you have that configured, you can certainly go to the assign section like I did here. And I usually do that with one of the layers. I just make a transport out of it. So I hope that helps a little.
I I think some of this can get a little bit confusing, obviously, because when you get into multiple USB connections and there's also FireWire, there's an option to do MIDI over FireWire and MIDI over USB, and it just takes a few minutes to set up. I remember the first time I went through it, I just had to think it through, and it took 15 minutes or so, and I got it configured into my digital audio workstation. Somebody was also asking about scene up and down, maybe off of a foot control, and that should be possible just using the MIDI in jack on the back. What was the question?
Chris Pater asked, is it possible to use all 8 effects processors as inserts?
Answer for that is yes. If, for example, as a monitor console, you might not need all those reverbs. You can insert 31-band graphic EQs on every slot and use them all as inserts. The only thing you can't do is the opposite. You can't use the last 4 as bus sends, but you can certainly use them all as inserts if you need to.
Yeah, I was going to mention too that you should really check out some of the different effects that are in those 40 different effects processors. John, if you can pull up the Wave Designer, that's a really, really cool. This is like a transient designer kind of thing where throw that, maybe subgroup your kick and snare, or even your whole drum group onto a set of subgroups, and insert that Wave Designer on it. And there's just a couple of controls on it, but man, you can really grab the kick and the snare and put them exactly where you want them in the mix. It's really a cool effect.
For House of Worship setup, John is asking, is the Matrix a better option than a post-aux send?
There's that Wave Designer Joe was talking about.
Yeah, and it's 2 channels. I mean, you could even just stick it on your kick and snare channel. Just experiment with it. That one's great.
That's a great example of, if you look at the top above the Wave Designer here, let's say I have my, kick and snare. You can simply just assign, there's my kick on one side of it, my snares on the other side. So a lot of these stereo slots can be used to process, 2 channels independently, as long as it's not a stereo reverb or something like that.
Somebody was just asking in a church environment, a matrix, group versus a post fader aux send. And I think once again, it really just gets into your specific needs, and how you lay everything out. I personally just always, whenever I had to create a dedicated mix that I just didn't want to mess with that much, I tended to always use matrix groups to feed. Like I said, the common one was, like I said, the video guy that needed a mix really quick. And once I knew he had solid level on his camera or whatever, I could just I didn't have to mess with it again,
I think the question you got to ask yourself is if you want to set up subgroups or not, because if you
that's the big decision right there. And if you have the groups to spare.
He added that it's for video.
What's that?
He just mentioned that he added it's for video in his church setup.
Yeah. Yeah, for video, I would probably go with a matrix mix if you can afford to use some of your buses as subgroups, and that's really a decision that only you could make. If you're already using them for, a lot of other sends that you can't live without, then you're not going to have the ability to do that.
I think in the analog world, Joe, you were always using subgroups. Maybe a little, you didn't have the DCAs to work with, maybe, and maybe it was a little more. Whereas on the X32, with all this routing, like if you're doing a bunch of monitor mixes and you're running monitors in front of house on the same board, you might not have all the luxury of creating all those subgroups.
Okay.
But yeah. What else do we have here? Someone asked about how many presets are available. The presets are 102. You have 100 channel strip presets, 100 effects presets, and 100 routing presets. And that's in addition to the 100 scenes that you have on the board. So the scenes are full snapshots, and the presets are just specialized presets for particular processors, such as either effects, channel strip, or routing. Oh, someone asked about the main level in the iPad app. We're aware of this bug, and I believe there should be a new version, like a 1.1.1. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah, yep.
So it's not you, it's the program, and we'll hopefully have it fixed very soon.
There's also, we realized that the gain control on the TalkBack mic in the default preset was just way too hot. And as soon as you back that off, generally, I don't know about you guys, but usually the TalkBack mic is kind of a set it and forget it kind of thing, and you just use it when you need to communicate. But the default preset was just, the gain was just way too hot, and it was causing some different issues. And so in the new version, that's one of the things that's going to be just built into the default. But if you have an X32, I'd recommend going in and backing down your level to what are they going to set it at, John? I think I said it was minus 15 or something.
Yeah, it's set at -6 by default. I'd back it off by about 10 dB, and you can get to that by pressing View by the TalkBack section.
I have to say, once your TalkBack mic is set up properly on the X32, it's very functional. I've never really had a live console where I would use an internal TalkBack mic. I mean, I would usually carry a basic dynamic mic with me and plug it into the high channel and communicate. Use that as my TalkBack mic. But the shootout that we did recently, it worked flawlessly. I mean, it was great. You just communicate to your wedges or whatever else you want to go to, So guys, we're at 3:07 right now. We're going to stay on the line until 3:15, and then we'll wrap it up because I know we started a little bit late. Anybody, I fully understand if you guys need to get off because we're supposed to be done at 3. So anybody that has to leave, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I really hope the information was useful. We're going to try to do these pretty regularly. I have product specialists. I have 6 of them in the U.S., and we have guys in Europe and Asia and in Australia. So what my goal is to have each group of guys do one of these maybe once a week, so we can probably get multiple webinars going. And just pop in whenever you want. If there's a question you have, we're going to actually just try to do it in real time for you and keep you guys up and running.
And for those of you, I see some other things asking about. We are planning on doing other editions of this where we'll focus in on some more specific topics. For example, hooking up your favorite DAW and recording. And we just for this first one, we just wanted to keep it as a general overview. And we definitely have some ideas for the future. And appreciate your comments on that also.
Yeah, guys, even before you leave, if there's a topic that in a future edition of this that you want us to cover, I'm not saying we can get to every specific request, but if we see that 3 or 4 people are asking the same thing over and over again, then like John said, we'll cover different topics. We're going to try to do one on DAWs, like John said, or maybe we'll do one on setting up a Q edge if you're using the X32 as a monitor board. Just different topics like that. Anything to make your lives easier using the X32. We're going to try to do, maybe the first 45 minutes to an hour on a specific topic.
You can ask people to send their emails and questions.
We have the master list of everybody who came, so we should have all their emails.
Oh yeah, we did. He's asking about pre-post when you're using the FireWire, if you want to have it post dynamics. You actually do have the ability to.
Do you want me to show your screen again, Joe?
Yeah, real quick. I'm just going to show quick for any of you guys that are recording and you want to use the processing on the X32, like the EQ and the dynamics, and you want to record post. There is a workaround that will allow you to do this to an extent. If you go to the routing menu. you have the analog out page here. Assuming you're in the studio, you're probably not using all these analog outs. So, on your first 8 analog outs, you could assign. Let's see. You would tap it post fader, right? Yeah. You could assign direct outs and post fader, and you should be able to get 16 channels in that way. And then on your card output, I think we're working on a better solution for this, though, aren't we, Joe?
Yeah.
So we'll have to stay posted on that. But there are some routing options. Basically, what I'm saying is there's no direct way to do it, but there are some workarounds. Another thing that you can do, you'll notice on this card output menu, you have these P16 buses. So if you're not using the P16, you can go into the P16 menu and assign, direct out of channel 3 post fader to P16 output 1, and then go to card output and send the P16 bus down.
Yeah, this is one that came up this week, and the developers got back with this. It's just another bank of 16 buses that are kind of available for routing. And you might not think of using them because, I don't have a P16. Why would I be routing to the P16? But it really is just a dedicated bank of 16 buses.
Yep. I want to answer this publicly, even though I answered it in text. I've had this question a few times this week alone. When you're looking at the scene menu and you see the word scene safes, that means if you check that box, that means you're excluding that item from the scene. So a scene safe means that you would be excluding that item. So that's why by default, when you look at the scene menu, these are all unchecked. And that's because you'll be saving everything. And I've had quite a few people who think that you should check all of them to save everything, but it's actually the opposite. So,
and it's an interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up, John, because I read on the forums this week that this is due to some language barriers where, obviously this is in English, and certain languages don't use a difference between SAFE, safe, and SAVE for save, so that there was a lot of confusion about the meaning of that word. So hopefully John clarified that a little bit.
Looking for some more stuff here. We have a question here. If there's time, please show how to mix pre and post sends on a per channel basis. And yeah, there's time because it's actually very easy. You would select the channel, whichever channel you wanted to work with, and on the actual X32, you would be pressing View near the bus sends encoders, or you can tab over to the Sends tab, like I'm doing in X Control. Now, again, this is a little bit of a difference between X Control and and what you're going to see on the console. But basically, on the console, you'd press the Layer Down button, and you would use the rotary encoders to switch your sends between pre-post EQ or pre-post fader. And when you're doing it by channel, it's actually on a pair. It does the work by pairs. Okay. Now, if you wanted to do and while I'm doing it, I'll just show you that if you wanted to do a bus, you could actually select a bus, go to the Config tab, and you could actually change that bus globally. So if you just want every send on that bus to be pre-EQ, there you go. So those are the 2 ways you can do it.
All right, guys, we're at 3:30. Once again, I want to thank everybody for coming, and we are going to be posting other events that we're going to be doing, hopefully possibly a couple a week. Those are going to be up on all the different forums. I usually post these. They put them on the Behringer Facebook page and also directly on the Behringer.com page. So, yeah, keep your eyes open for those, and if you could make it, we'd love to have you. And have a great day. Thanks, everybody.